Last time we ended our journey in the fateful year of 1921, when peace was concluded with the USSR. But there was another very important event in the same month, the introduction of the March Constitution. This constitution created a parliamentary system and ensured that the role of the president was purely representative, and with very limited powers. In the grand scope, it was an attack against the chief of state, Pilsudski, who refused to run for that office. Seeing peace secured and the new state slowly developing, he decided to retire from his position as chief of state, handing over his powers to the first elected president of Poland, Gabriel Narutowicz, in December of 1922. Narutowicz, being a friend of Pilsudski and a supporter of his federal idea, was instantly hated by the National Democrats. Upon his election, they began a hate campaign unprecedented in Polish history, calling him the Jew president, the Mason. And then he was assassinated only 5 days after his presidency started. It was a catastrophic blow to the young state, and it would only become worse from there. The parliamentary system introduced by the March Constitution on one hand led to the political scene in Poland to flourish and grow. We see movements appearing that otherwise wouldn't have organized, but at the same time, it led to the infamous Sejmocracy, the rule of the parliament, in which government survived for months, sometimes only for days before resigning, as new configurations took place in the parliament. The political and partisan divide in the nation became more and more toxic, with peasant supporters, socialists and nationalists on the verge of street fights. After only 5 years of peace, Poland had a dozen failed governments, but May of 1926 would bring a fateful change. On May 10, 1926, a coalition formed of National Democrats, Nationalist Workers' Party, and the Polish People's Party, Piast. It was Wito's third government, and within it there was those regarded as morally responsible for the murder of the first president. The legionary veterans and patriots that once fought to build the state and achieve independence were until now watching from the sidelines. But Pilsudski, after years of retirement, decided to make a comeback. "I shall fight like before, with the main evil of the state, the power of unruly parties over Poland, forgetting about imponderables, but always remembering about pennies and benefits." On May 12, 1926, what was supposed to be a bloodless demonstration turned into an upheaval, ultimately leading to the resignation of Prime Minister Witos and President Wojciechowski. The absolute priority of the Pilsudskiites that now came to be known as sanacja, which is Latin for healing, was to ensure the health and well-being of the state. Nonetheless, Pilsudski decided against any radical moves and allowed the parliament and parties to continue as usual. Pilsudski saw himself as a Democrat at heart, but believed that the state-damaging system had to be overwritten. As he was admired as a moral authority by most of the nation, the parliament voted on him becoming president, but he declined. Instead, the famous Polish chemist and discoverer Ignacy Mościcki was elected for that office. Minor constitutional amendments by the end of 1926 increased the president's power. Plans for a new constitution were designed ever since the May upheaval of 1926, but it was in 1928, after the national elections, that a constitutional commission was formed. Starting in October of 1928, all political parties or groups represented in the Sejm would develop and hand in their projects for the new constitution. Let us take a look at the different political groups and their models for the Polish state. The Sanation camp already founded a political group in 1927, led by one of Pilsudski's closest friends, Walery Sławek. It was called the Non-Partisan Bloc for Cooperation with the Government, shortened BBWR. It achieved 21% of the votes in the 1928 election, but not enough to introduce a new constitution. Before looking at the constitution they planned and ultimately introduced, let's look at the other political groups first. The Indeczo drafted a constitution with a weaker president, a strong parliament and senate, which combined instead of National Assembly would simply be called the Sejm, and their project proposed to raise the age to vote, but also to prolong the terms for the Senate. Influence of national and religious minorities on the state would be completely removed. A coalition made of People's Party Piast, the Christian Democrats, and, unusually, the Nationalist Workers' Party created a project that would give clear competences to the parliament, where the executive would not be able to intervene. Left-wing and socialist parties such as the PPS, the People's Liberation Party, and the Peasants' Party would have the most radical vision among the opposition's parties. They demanded that the constitution abolish the elitist Senate and introduce a referendum to elect the president. Also, it postulated the abolition of any church and state relations, demanded autonomy for national minorities, and the removal of property rights from the constitution. No party had a majority to pass any constitutional amendments, let alone introduce a new constitution. But in 1930, President Mościcki decided to dissolve the same, leading to early elections, which now gave quite a majority to the BBWR of 46%. Now the path for a new constitution was paved. It is at this time when we see the complex and often different ideas that appeared within the Pilsudskiite camp for this new constitution. On 6th of August 1933, the veterans of the Polish Legion celebrated the 19th anniversary of the march from Oleandry Street in Kraków that began their fight for independence. It was during that meeting that Valery Slavik presented his vision for a new Poland. A Poland not divided by class struggle, without nepotism or corruption. A Poland in which civic duty and patriotism were more important than class or ethnic background. At the same time, a new class of knights would rise, a nobility by merit. This legion of merit would grant people who have contributed to the independence and well-being of the state more influence over it. It would have a place in the Senate and include citizens awarded with the highest military decoration, the Virtuti Militari, and the Cross of Independence, awarded to both civilians and soldiers. Fearing that such an institution could lead to samurai-like honor suicides, Prime Minister Świtalski decided to remove the Legion of Merit from the draft of the Constitution. In January of 1935, the Constitutional Commission concluded its work, and the new highest law of the state now only had to be ratified and published. That was done on March 23rd with a simple majority in the parliament and with a slight trick. Many of the opposition representatives were not present during the voting. Following that, the Pilsudskiites broke out in euphoria, celebrating and singing the March of the 1st Brigade in the Parliament building. Less than a month later, on the 23rd of April 1935, with a majestic ceremony in the Warsaw Royal Castle, the presidential residence, President Mościcki, along with members of the government, signed the new constitution into life. It was the last official signature of the ailing Marshal Józef Pilsudski, who signed as Minister of Military Affairs. Thus, the April Constitution would be remembered as his political testament. Pilsudski passed away less than a month later, on May 12, 1935, leaving a nation orphaned. Now we can finally get to the Constitution itself. The first chapter is titled The Republic of Poland. Let's listen to the first two articles. The Polish state is the common weal of all its citizens. Resurrected by the efforts and sacrifices of its worthiest sons, it is to be bequeathed as a historic heritage from generation to generation. It is the duty of each generation to increase the power and authority of the state by its own efforts. For the fulfillment of this duty, each generation is responsible to posterity with its honor and good name. The President of the Republic stands at the head of the state. The responsibility before God and history for the destinies of the state rests on him. His supreme duty is to care for the welfare of the state, for its readiness to meet attack, and for its position among the nations of the world. The one and indivisible authority of the state is united in his person. The system, tone, and worldview that these first two articles alone espouse are almost diametrically opposed to that of the previous nationalist and parliamentary March Constitution. Historian Professor Wiesław Jan Wysocki puts it as follows. The word nation does not appear in the text of the Constitution of 1935. That word carried extreme importance since the 19th century, because when the Polish state disappeared, the nation became its exemplification. In the moment when we regained our state, and this is the Pilsudskiite thought, the state became the superior element. We have to remember that the reborn Republic of Poland was a multinational state, and this way they made a gesture by emphasizing civic duty and loyalty to one's own state. This state replaced the nation in its legal and international significance and was represented by the president, who was only responsible before God and history. As Professor Wysocki put it, citizenship and civic merit was put in the first place, but the Constitution also grants special privileges to those who have served the country. Article 7 of the Constitution, for instance, declares that the right of a citizen to influence public affairs is estimated according to his efforts and services, while forbidding any of these rights to be limited on the basis of origin, sex, or nationality. This chapter also declares that the lever of collective life is every individual citizen's creativeness, grants every citizen the possibility of developing their personal capabilities, liberty of conscience, speech, and assembly, with its only limit being the common good. Overall, we can say that the citizen is given vast liberties and rights, while at the same time receiving moral and material responsibilities, such as the service to the state and the common good, through, for instance, military service.
Zmagania się legionów i polskiej organizacji wojskowej, a później wielkie boje Wojska Polskiego stworzyły wspaniałe tradycje licznych pułków Armii Polskiej, które z roku na rok napływającym zastępom młodzieży wpajają najszczytniejsze uczucia rycerskości i honoru oraz gotowości poniesienia wszelkich ofiar, aż do ofiary życia w obronie ojczyzny.
Now we come to the second crucial element of the Constitution, the presidential system. The president is granted special personal rights called prerogatives. Such prerogatives such as the right to appoint the Prime Minister, the President of the Supreme Court, the appointment and dismissal of the Commander-in-Chief and the Inspector General of the Armed Forces. He could also nominate judges to the Tribunal of State and nominate 1/3 of the senators. A historically very significant prerogative is his right to appoint his successor in times of war. And finally, his right to nominate one of the two candidates for his successor in time of peace. Now you may ask, how is such a powerful figure elected? The Constitution introduced a unique system with two candidates. A presidential term lasted 7 years. After that, the Electoral College, which is the combined Sejm and Senate, would choose a candidate for his successor. Here another prerogative comes into play, the president's right to name a second candidate. The two candidates would then be elected by a nationwide referendum. This way, the Constitution wanted to ensure that someone dignified is elected. Here, in the April Constitution, it was clearly emphasized that the president must be a dignified person, and if he is to be accountable before God and history, he must embody the majesty of the Republic. That generation had something like that. It was genuinely happy that it regained Poland, and it saw that majesty. Lawyers and law historians today call the system super-presidentialism, which partially implies that the classic separation of powers were abolished. In reality, all three branches of the powers were kept, while indeed, the president became an extraordinarily powerful figure. Here is how the state functioned in a nutshell. The president was the superordinate factor. He coordinated all the activities of the supreme organs. The president appointed the prime minister and on his recommendation nominated the ministers. Those ministers directed their respective departments or executed special tasks entrusted to them. Also, the president convened and dissolved the parliament, made up of the lower house, the Sejm, and the upper house, the Senate. The Sejm consisted of deputies elected by universal, secret, equal, and direct suffrage with a term of 5 years. Every citizen had the right to vote after completing 24 years of age. Now the Senate is a little bit different. 2/3 of the Senate are elected just like the Sejm, while 1/3 is nominated by the president. Together, the parliament passed legislature, regulated the budget, taxes, the monetary system, and so on. Laws could also be passed by decrees of the president directly. Finally, we have the judicative. Judges were independent in the discharge of their judicial duties, and sentences could not be changed or annulled by any other authority. In the annexes of the Constitution, we find the guarantee of the rights of national minorities, religious freedom, and the special relation between church and state. The Catholic Church governed itself by its own laws and was recognized as the majority religion within the state, while granting equal rights to all other religions. This was the Constitution in a nutshell. As I mentioned, one of the presidential prerogatives would play an important role in the survival of Polish statehood after the catastrophic September campaign in 1939. Two totalitarian regimes, Germany and the USSR, invaded Poland and partitioned it among them. But the state kept living. Not only in the form of the underground state, but also the legal government of the Republic kept its recognition. President Mościcki, after being detained by Romanian authorities on his way to France, resigned and appointed General Wieniawa Długoszowski as his successor, a legendary cavalry general. But he declined. And finally, Władysław Raczkiewicz, former voivode of Pomerania, became the new president of the Republic. The anti-Senation opposition around Sikorski took the post of the prime minister in government, while the president was from the Senation camp. In 1945, when the Soviets occupied all of Poland, the Allies decided to withdraw the recognition of the legal Polish government and switch to recognize the communist puppet state in Lublin. Now only a few countries like the Vatican, the Republic of Ireland, and the Spanish state recognize the government of the Republic. Nonetheless, the government continued its activities, harboring contacts with opposition and independence movements in Soviet-occupied Poland throughout the Cold War. Organizations such as the Independence Thought, led by General Roman Abraham, and the successors, the Confederation of Independent Poland and the Polish Independence Party, also had contact to the legal president in London. Following an agreement between the communist authorities and parts of the opposition in 1989, and a year later the election of Lech Wałęsa as president, the exile government, despite protests within the independence movement, decided to return to Poland and pass their authority and constitution to the new president. Once again in the Warsaw Royal Castle, the constitution was put on site in a ceremony, and the last president of the Republic in exile, Ryszard Kaczorowski, passed the insignia of power and the constitution to President Lech Wałęsa, ending the over 50 years activity of the exiled government. It is still a heated debate amongst lawyers and historians to this day whether the April Constitution was ever revoked or illegal in the first place. Unfortunately, the idea of returning to the Constitution for at least a day was not realized, and instead a new constitution was created in 1997 that essentially made the Third Republic a successor of the communist Polish People's Republic. Ideals such as dignity and majesty and the state as a common weal are no longer regarded by the state officials, nor are they noticed by the citizens.